There's a moment I think about often. I was on a trail run through Forest Park in Portland, Oregon. No headphones, just the sound of the wind in the trees, a creek running somewhere below the trail, birds doing their thing overhead. And then the thought hit me, out of nowhere and completely unwelcome, that my two boys, who were 3 and 1 at the time, might never get to hear that. If we let climate change go unchecked, if we just don't do anything. And I remember thinking, I'm just an emergency room doctor. What can I do about this? G'day team, and welcome back to Overheard in the Emergency Room. I'm your host, Dr. Adrian Coyce, emergency medicine physician, evidence nerd, and someone who has thought a lot about what it means to take care of people in a world that is genuinely getting harder to live in. Today's episode is a little different. There is no patient case because this one is personal. It's about a moment that changed how I think about my role as a physician and how I think about my responsibility to the planet. Climate change and human health are inextricably linked. That is not a political statement, it is a medical one. And by the end of this episode, you will understand why and what you can do about it. Before we dive in, if you find this useful, please like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell. And for more free health resources, visit my website, drcoyce.com. Let's get into it. Let's start with my basic claim and we can build from there. You ready for it? Climate change is real. It is driven by human activity and it is already making people sick. I want to give credit to a landmark paper by Sorensen and others published in 2020, which really crystallized this for me. It outlines in detail the range of pathologies that are directly exacerbated by a warming planet and frames the emergency physician's role as one of advocacy and action. It was an article that answered my trail run question. Let me walk you through the major disease categories because this is where climate change becomes clinical. So first off, air pollution. It is the most significant environmental cause of disease and premature death on Earth. In 2015, pollution-related diseases caused an estimated 9 billion premature deaths. That's 16% of all deaths worldwide. 3 times more deaths than AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria combined. And what's the main driver? Burning fossil fuels. And here's the equity issue that I want you to hear. Burning fossil fuels in higher middle income countries generates 85% of the airborne particulate pollution in low income countries. We export our pollution and they absorb our consequences. Clinically, we see this as asthma exacerbations, COPD exacerbations, cardiac arrests, cardiopulmonary admissions. We see it in our waiting rooms. Next up, allergens and pollen. Climate change is prolonging pollen seasons. A retrospective chart review of an urban ED found a positive correlation between tree pollen counts and asthma exacerbation presentations. Projections suggest that a 14% increase in ED visits will be related to pollen and seed exacerbations by the year 2090. That's more patients, more presentations, more burden on an already stretched and almost broken system. Temperature extremes and heat waves. We are seeing more extreme heat events and they are lethal. Following a 2011 heat wave in Sydney and Australia, all-cause ED visits rose by 2%. Ambulance calls rose by 14% and all-cause mortality by 13%. In France in 2003, an unprecedented heat wave caused 14,800 excess deaths. Projections from a group led by Kingsley suggest that up to 1.6% increase in all-cause mortality and a 25% increase in heat-related mortality will happen by century's end, disproportionately affecting those under 18 and those over 65. In my practice, that means more elderly patients presenting in crisis, more pediatric cases, more heat stroke, more renal colic, more atrial fibrillation. Wildfires. Wildfire smoke increases concentrations of fine particulate matter. This hammers the respiratory system. A 2007 Australian wildfire event showed a positive correlation between particulate matter 2.5 and asthma exacerbation, with a 1.9% increase in ED visits up to 2 days after the event exposure. Think about the next time you see a wildfire on the news. For every day of smoke, there are EDs all across that region absorbing the wave. Infectious disease and ecosystem disruption. When we disrupt ecosystems and push into previously wild areas, we create conditions for zoonotic diseases and breakthrough. SARS-CoV-2 originating in bats via an intermediary species is the most dramatic recent example. As human settlements expand and deforestation increases our contact with animal reservoirs, the risk doesn't go away, it grows. Emergency departments will increasingly be the front line for monitoring and managing novel pathogens. In 2017, Hurricane Harvey reduced hospital capacity by approximately 40%. Beds lost to water damage, staff were unavailable to reach facilities, and patient transfers were halted. What Harvey modeled for us in the acute manifestation of the climate crisis is that as disasters become more frequent and more severe, our systems need to be more resilient. And that resiliency starts with us. I want to pause here and say something important and underappreciated. Climate change is not an equal opportunity problem. The communities that bear the greatest burden of climate-related illness are minority communities, low-income communities, the very old and the very young. These are very often the exact patients who come through our emergency departments. When the air quality is worst, it usually hits harder in the lower-income neighborhoods. When the heat is most deadly, it affects the people who can't afford air conditioning. When the floods come, it is the people without insurance who can't rebuild and continue with their lives. This is a health equity issue as much as it is an environmental one. And it is one more reason this belongs in our clinical frame and is the purview of healthcare professionals everywhere. So here's the uncomfortable truth. The US healthcare sector is responsible for approximately 8.5% of US national greenhouse gas emissions. If it were a country, it would be in the top 15 global emitters. We as healthcare professionals are part of the problem, and that means we have a role in finding and enacting the solution. About 3/4 of those emissions come from the supply chain. So that's procurement decisions, device manufacturing, and pharmaceutical production, which means every purchasing decision we make in a clinical setting is a climate decision. And there are proof points that change is possible. So here's a few examples. When residency programs at a Pacific Northwest University hospital shifted to virtual interviews during the COVID-19 pandemic, our analysis estimated median savings of 0.47 metric tons of CO2 and $490 per applicant per interview cycle. This is the carbon equivalent of approximately 22 mature trees sequestering carbon for a whole year. In another example, Austin Travis County, Texas EMS transitioned their ambulances to hybrid and biodiesel. They saved 14.2 metric tons of CO2 per year and also cut their fuel costs significantly. These are not abstract wins, they are measurable. They are quantifiable and they come from within the system when people simply decide to act. So I want to give you a practical framework. Think of it as educate, mitigate, and advocate. And this applies whether you are a healthcare professional, a medical student, or a member of the general public who wants to understand their role in fixing this problem. So first up, educate. The ED visit is often the only healthcare touchpoint that some patients have in a year. That 30-second conversation at the bedside can plant a seed. Guidis and colleagues outline how climate health education fits squarely within the American Board of Emergency Medicine's Knowledge, Skills, and Abilities Statement on Prevention and Education. Practically, this can look like pulling up airnow.gov when discharging a patient after a smoke-related asthma exacerbation and show them how to read the air quality index for their neighborhood. Or reviewing heat risk medications with an elderly patient during a heat wave and pointing them towards local cooling centers. When you do this, document it in the chart, the very same way you would when you counsel someone against tobacco. Normalize it, make it part of the clinical encounter. And if you're involved in graduate medical education, our scoping review that was published in GME on climate curricula found only 17 published accounts of climate-related topics across all US GME programs. 17 across the entire country. Emergency medicine had the most, and it still wasn't enough. The good news, you don't need a full curriculum block. Just a single slide embedded into an existing lecture is a great starting point. ClimateHealthED.org has ready-made evidence-based slide decks, so start there. Next up, mitigate. This is about reducing our own sector's footprint. So select one sustainability goal per year and build a quality improvement cycle around it. Track CO2 equivalents alongside your usual QI metrics. When waste to recycling ratio appears beside door to physician time in the annual report, it signals to trainees that environmental stewardship is part of the clinical excellence framework. You can frame this in language your administrators will understand. Talk about resilience, risk reduction, and cost saving. A reliable, renewable energy source protects the hospital during grid failures in disaster events. That is not a soft argument, that is patient safety. And finally, advocate. You should run quarterly tabletop drills with climate-specific scenarios. Wildfire, smoke, heat events, flooding. This is a core disaster medicine training reframed for a world with a changing climate. When contracts come up for renewal, ask vendors for their environmental product declarations or their scope 1 through 3 emissions data. Include sustainability as a bid criteria. Every budget meeting should be a climate meeting. You can mentor your trainees. Residents want projects with impact. Climate health offers a rich menu. ED heat protocols, waste stream analyses, smoke event patient education tools. One resident-led project can seed a departmental movement. I want to take a moment here to talk about something that sits at the intersection of two things I care about deeply: what you eat and what it costs the planet. Deforestation is a significant driver of greenhouse gas emissions, and it is driven largely by animal agriculture, specifically land cleared to raise cattle. So when we talk about reducing red meat consumption, we are having a climate conversation and a health conversation simultaneously. The EAT-Lancet Commission demonstrated that universal adoption of a plant-rich diet with severe limitation of red meat consumption could prevent approximately 11 million premature deaths per year through 2050. So here's how I use this in my practice. When a patient comes into the emergency department with chest pain and we start talking about heart disease and diet, I ask them, what do you know about the connection between red meat and heart disease? And then I talk about what it costs the planet to produce that beef and what happens when you swap it, even partially, for beans, lentils, or tofu. It's healthier for you, it's better for the planet. One conversation, but two wins. All right, I want to talk about two claims you've probably encountered. And before I tell you what the evidence says, I want to flag the technique being used to sell each one to you. Myth number one. Electric vehicles are more emissions intensive than internal combustion engines. You've probably all heard this one. What about a battery? What about manufacturing? EVs are actually worse. It's a persuasive argument because it sounds specific and technical. That specificity is a manipulation technique, cherry picking, the manufacturing phase of the life cycle and ignoring everything else. Cradle to grave life cycle assessments consistently show that even in regions with carbon-heavy electricity grids, EVs produce lower total lifetime emissions than petrol or diesel vehicles. As grids get cleaner, that gap widens further. So your one-line takeaway here is that manufacturing a battery has a footprint, but you pay it back within the first couple of years of driving. Over a vehicle's lifetimes, EVs win on emissions, full stop. And myth number two, regenerative or grass-fed beef is a net environmental benefit. Now, this one is a little more subtle and it comes from a place that sounds reasonable. If the cattle are grazing on grassland and that land sequesters carbon, doesn't that offset the emissions from the animals themselves? The manipulation technique here is a false balance. They present a scenario where some of the variables look favorable while ignoring the full accountability. And here's the reality. Grass-fed beef requires more land and a longer time to reach market weight, which means more land use emissions and more methane over the animal's lifetime.
From methane is from red meat, beef, and dairy. One of the largest causes of human-caused methane globally is from them. So this is not a good source of feeding the world when you have one of the largest sources of methane, which is one of the biggest contributors to climate change. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, the sixth assessment report showed just this past year that since industrialization, methane has warmed the planet anywhere from about 33 to as high as about 44% if you factor in some of the other gases that have caused some cooling. So methane is a huge important factor here. So this is one reason why we should be first looking at beef and dairy to eliminate from diets. The second one, they disproportionately use the most land. Using the most land displaces native ecosystems that we need. It also prevents the drawdown of carbon that we need to rebalance the atmosphere to something that's more livable in the future. The best source of doing that is forest and native protected ecosystems and rewilding.
When you compare it to cradle to grave against beans, lentils, or tofu, the emissions and land use footprint of beef, regenerative or otherwise, is not even close. This does not mean that you can never eat beef. This means the claim that regenerative beef is a net climate solution is just not supported by the full life cycle evidence. So now you're probably asking, what can I do? And you don't need to overhaul your lifestyle or retrofit your department this week. Here are a few things you can do, some for healthcare professionals and some for everyone else. For healthcare professionals, you can teach one thing. So mention air quality or heat risk to a patient and document it as preventive counseling. Change one thing. Identify a waste stream or energy policy to improve and launch a quality improvement cycle around it. And share one thing. Bring a success story or a data point to your next faculty meeting or residence conference. For everyone else, look at your diet. Even 1 or 2 plant-forward meals per week is a meaningful start for your health and for the planet. Pay attention to air quality. Bookmark airnow.gov or download an AQI or Air Quality Index app. On high pollution days, especially if you have lung or heart disease, modify your outdoor activity. And finally, use your voice, whether that's at the ballot box, at a community meeting, or in a conversation with your GP. Your voice on this topic matters. Physicians rank among the most trusted voices in public discourse on health. And so do you. Let me take you back to that trail run. I asked myself, I'm just an emergency room doctor, what can I do? And the answer, it turns out, is quite a lot. I can educate patients at the bedside, I can mentor trainees, I can advocate for procurement decisions that reduce our sector's footprint, I can run quality improvement cycles, I can publish, I can speak, and I can vote with intention on this issue. And so can you. You don't have to be a physician to do most of this. The time to act was actually in the 1980s. We know that now.
We clearly have reached the stage where we are capable, both intentionally and inadvertently, to make significant changes in the global climate and in the global ecosystem. And we've probably been doing, on a smaller scale, things like that for a very long period of time. For example, slash and burn agriculture, which has been with us for tens of thousands of years probably, changes the climate to some extent by changing the albedo, the reflectivity of the earth. That massive changes have occurred is clear from the historical record. For example, Egypt was once the breadbasket of the Roman Empire. It may be the same role as the American Midwest plays today. That is certainly no longer the case. It's not a greenhouse effect issue. It may be an overgrazing issue, but is an example of how humans are perfectly capable of making these unexpected and inadvertent changes. Because the effects occupy more than a human generation, there is a tendency to say that they are not our problem. Of course, then they are nobody's problem. Not on my tour of duty, not on my term of office. It's something for the next century. Let the next century worry about it. But the problem is that there are effects, and the greenhouse effect is one of them, which have long time constants. If you don't worry about it now, it's too late later on. And so in this issue, as in so many other issues, we are passing on extremely grave problems for our children when the time to solve the problems, if they can be solved at all, is now.
We didn't act fast enough, but we are not out of options, and we are not out of time. The physics of this problem is not on our side if we do nothing. But the evidence on what happens when communities and healthcare systems act is genuinely hopeful. I run through Forest Park sometimes and I still hear the birds and the water. I want my boys to hear them too. There are no healthy humans on an unhealthy planet. And that is why this belongs in our conversation. If you found this episode useful, please share it with a colleague, a patient, a family member. These ideas grow when they travel. Next episode, we're going to shift back to something equally close to home. I'll be talking with you about a topic I know a lot of healthcare workers need to hear: the evidence on protein. Until then, team, have a great day, and I'll see you next time as we chase fewer bad days and more good decades.